Rivers across Europe have dropped so low, they're giving up secrets that were supposed to stay buried. A sunken warship from the Second World War. An unexploded 700-kilogram bomb, sitting quietly on a riverbed for over 80 years, suddenly exposed to open air. This is what a continent looks like when it runs out of water. This summer, Europe isn't just having a hot few weeks. It is living through one of the most severe combined heat and drought crises in its recent history. And unlike a single sudden disaster, this one has been building slowly, quietly, for months until it reached a point where rivers are shrinking, farmland is cracking, and tens of millions of people are being told to change how they live simply because the water isn't there anymore. Let's start with how this actually began. Because a crisis like this doesn't appear overnight. It builds layer by layer, starting long before anyone feels the heat. Back in the spring of 2026, something was already going wrong, even though it didn't look dramatic at the time. Between April and June, large parts of the continent, stretching all the way from Portugal in the southwest to southern Finland in the northeast, received far less rain than normal. Not a total absence of rain, just persistently less than usual, month after month. On its own, a dry spring isn't unusual. Europe has had dry springs before, but this time it set the stage for everything that followed, because the ground itself, the soil that farms and forests and rivers all depend on, went into summer already thirsty. Then came the heat. Starting in late May, a series of heat waves began sweeping across the continent, hitting the United Kingdom, Portugal, France, Ireland, Spain, Germany, the Benelux countries, and Romania. These weren't isolated hot days. They were sustained periods of extreme temperatures, arriving in waves, each one adding more stress onto ground and rivers that hadn't recovered from the last one. By the end of May, a location in Mora, Portugal recorded a temperature of just over 40 degrees Celsius, well above what's normal for that time of year. From there, the pattern repeated itself again and again through June, July, and into August. Every time it seemed like temperatures might ease, another heat dome would form, another wave would roll across the map, and another region would get pushed further into drought. Scientists studying this pattern describe it almost like compounding interest. Each heat wave on its own might be survivable, but when they arrive back to back, without enough time in between for rain to recover the soil or rivers to refill, the damage doesn't just add up, it multiplies. By August, the consequences were impossible to ignore. Europe's major rivers, the ones that entire regions depend on for drinking water, agriculture, shipping, and electricity, had dropped to record low levels. The Loire in France, the Po in Italy, the Danube running through Central and Eastern Europe, and the Rhine, one of the most important rivers on the entire continent, all hit historic lows. In Germany, the Rhine became one of the most visible symbols of this crisis. Along its banks near Cologne, the riverbed that would normally be underwater was left exposed, cracked and dry, with the water level dropping to just 74 centimeters, an extraordinarily low reading for a river this size. For a country like Germany, where the Rhine isn't just a river but a working artery of the economy, carrying barges loaded with coal, chemicals, and industrial goods, a drop like this isn't just a striking photograph. It becomes an economic problem. When water levels fall too low, heavy barges either have to carry lighter loads or stop moving altogether, creating delays and higher costs that ripple outward into supply chains far beyond the riverbank itself. And the low water didn't just create economic headaches, it also uncovered pieces of history that had been hidden for generations. In the Danube, as water levels dropped in the region near Prhovo, the exposed riverbed revealed the wreck of a sunken German warship from the Second World War, its metal hull sitting in shallow mud where deep water used to be. Nearby, in Slovakia, the falling river also exposed something far more dangerous. Police were called in to recover an unexploded bomb, a British device weighing over 700 kilograms, believed to have been dropped decades ago and resting undisturbed at the bottom of the river ever since. It had remained hidden, harmless, for as long as the water covered it. The drought brought it back into the light, along with the risk that came with it. Germany's difficulties this summer haven't been limited to the Rhine alone. Across the country, farmers have reported cracked, hardened topsoil in fields that would normally be lush at this point in the growing season. Forestry officials have raised alarms about the health of German woodlands, many of which are still recovering from previous drought years and are now being pushed further into stress, making them more vulnerable to pests, disease, and fire. Local water utilities in several regions have had to issue conservation notices, asking residents to limit non-essential water use, even in a country not typically associated with water scarcity. For a nation whose economy depends heavily on reliable industrial water supplies and river-based transport, this summer has served as an uncomfortable reminder of how much modern infrastructure quietly depends on a stable climate that can no longer be taken for granted. These discoveries capture something important about this crisis. It isn't only about heat. It's about what happens when water, Something so constant that we barely think about it simply stops being there in the amounts we've always relied on. Nowhere has that reality been felt more directly than in the United Kingdom. By late July, more than half of England had officially been declared to be in drought by the Environment Agency, a designation that triggers restrictions and emergency planning across the affected regions. In Wales, the situation was even more complete. The entire country was placed under drought status, following record stretches of time without meaningful rainfall. For ordinary people, this showed up in very practical ways. Hosepipe bans were introduced in multiple regions, meaning households were legally prohibited from using garden hoses to water lawns, wash cars, or fill paddling pools, all in an effort to conserve dwindling supplies. As the summer continued and another heatwave loomed, the drought status was expanded even further, adding more regions to the list, a sign that the crisis was still worsening rather than easing. The heat itself, meanwhile, kept setting new records. In mid-August, temperatures surpassing 35 degrees Celsius were recorded in several countries at once, with forecasters estimating that more than 135 million people across the continent would experience another wave of scorching conditions. In West London, the mercury climbed to 38.1 degrees Celsius, making it the hottest day of the year for the UK, and surpassing a previous high that had only just been set back in June. Fire crews across southern England found themselves battling wildfires in places not typically associated with that kind of danger, including in the New Forest, a landscape more commonly pictured as green and damp than scorched and burning. Beyond the headline numbers, the drought in the UK has quietly reshaped everyday life across entire communities. Reservoirs that supply major cities have dropped to levels not seen in years, prompting water companies to bring forward long-term contingency plans that had, until now, mostly existed on paper. Farmers across England have reported smaller harvests, with some crops failing outright in fields that simply couldn't get enough water during critical growth periods. Rivers that support fish populations and wildlife have grown warmer and shallower, creating conditions that stress aquatic ecosystems already under pressure from years of changing weather patterns. Even something as ordinary as a green lawn became, for many households this summer, a small visible marker of just how unusual the season had become, as gardens across the country turned brown and brittle under the sun. France, too, has been enduring its own version of this crisis, hit not just by heat, but by wildfires that have consumed enormous areas of land. Alongside Spain, France has seen tens of thousands of hectares burn this year, fires fueled directly by the same dryness affecting the rivers and soil elsewhere on the continent. Once the ground and vegetation become dry enough, even a small spark from a discarded cigarette, a piece of machinery, or a lightning strike can turn into an uncontrollable blaze within hours, especially when strong winds are added into the mix. Across French farmland, the drought has forced difficult decisions, season after season. Vineyards, orchards, and grain fields have all had to contend with irrigation restrictions imposed by local authorities, trying to balance the competing demands of agriculture, drinking water supplies, and the ecological needs of rivers already running low. In some departments, farmers have been permitted to draw water only during specific overnight hours, when evaporation is lower and demand from other users is reduced. Even with these measures, yields in several regions are expected to fall noticeably below average this year, a pattern that, if it continues summer after summer, threatens to reshape which crops remain viable to grow in parts of the country at all. Spain has faced some of the most extreme numbers of all. This year alone, wildfires have already burned through well over 100,000 hectares of land there, an area so large it becomes difficult to picture in any meaningful way. Entire hillsides, forests, and farmland have been reduced to blackened ground, some of it likely to take years or even decades to fully recover. What makes this year's crisis particularly alarming to scientists isn't just the heat or the drought or the wildfires individually. It's the way all three feed into each other, creating a cycle that keeps getting worse the longer it continues. Heat dries out soil. Dry soil can't support healthy vegetation. Dead, dry vegetation becomes fuel for wildfires. Fires destroy plant cover that would otherwise help retain moisture in the ground. And with less vegetation and drier soil, the land heats up even faster the next time a heat wave rolls through, because there's less natural cooling coming from evaporating moisture. Each piece of the cycle makes the next heat wave a little more dangerous, and every dry stretch afterward a little harder to recover from. This isn't the first time Europe has faced a summer like this. In 2022, an earlier combination of extreme heat and drought became one of the deadliest weather events the continent has experienced in modern memory, with estimated death tolls reaching into the tens of thousands and damages estimated at around 40 billion euros. That summer, one senior European Commission researcher described the conditions as potentially the worst drought Europe had experienced in 500 years. France recorded its driest July in 60 years. Over 100 villages ran completely out of drinking water, forcing emergency deliveries just to meet basic household needs. Water restrictions were placed across nearly the entire country, and the French Prime Minister at the time called it the worst drought in the nation's history, setting up a special crisis unit just to coordinate the response. That 2022 heat wave also crossed a threshold that had never been recorded before in the United Kingdom. Temperatures there surpassed 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in recorded history, a number that, until that summer, had seemed almost impossible for a country known more for gray skies and light rain than desert-level heat. Roads buckled under the temperature. Train services were suspended in places because tracks weren't designed to handle that kind of thermal expansion. Airport runways softened. It was a summer that forced an entire country to confront the fact that its infrastructure, built over generations for a much milder climate, simply wasn't ready for what was arriving. Then in 2025, another wave of extreme heat swept across the continent, this time stretching from April all the way through September, affecting an even wider list of countries, from Portugal to Russia. Estimates from that summer put the number of heat-related deaths well above 14,000 people, with some analyses suggesting the real total, once indirect and delayed effects are accounted for, may be closer to 16 or 17,000. That year, the most extreme temperatures arrived earlier than expected, with record-breaking heat already appearing in April, months before summer had even properly begun, an early warning sign of just how unpredictable these seasonal patterns had become. Now here we are again, in 2026, watching many of the same patterns repeat, in some cases even more severely. Rivers hitting new record lows, drought expanding into more regions rather than retreating, heat waves arriving not as isolated events, but as a near-constant rhythm through the summer months. Scientists studying these patterns increasingly describe Europe as the fastest warming continent on the planet, a distinction that isn't about it, necessarily, reaching the highest absolute temperatures anywhere on Earth, but about how quickly its average conditions are shifting compared to historical norms. And in many parts of Europe, especially regions that historically built their infrastructure, their agriculture, and even their homes around a cooler, wetter climate, that speed of change leaves less time to adapt. Consider what a summer like this actually asks of a country's infrastructure. Power plants that rely on river water for cooling can be forced to reduce output when river levels drop too low or water temperatures rise too high, because releasing overheated water back into an already stressed river can cause serious ecological damage. Farmers who depend on consistent irrigation face impossible choices about which crops to save and which to let fail, as reservoirs and groundwater levels drop faster than they can be replenished. Cities built decades ago, with limited green space and heat-absorbing materials like asphalt and concrete everywhere, become dramatically hotter than surrounding rural areas, turning ordinary neighborhoods into what scientists call urban heat islands, places where nighttime temperatures barely drop, offering residents no real relief even after the sun goes down. And then there's the human cost, which is often the hardest part of the story to fully convey, because heat doesn't kill in a single dramatic moment the way some other disasters do. It works quietly, often affecting the elderly, people with existing health conditions, outdoor workers, and those without access to reliable cooling over the course of days or weeks. Many heat-related deaths aren't even recorded as such directly, because the immediate cause might be listed as a heart attack, a stroke, or respiratory failure, conditions that extreme heat can trigger or worsen, especially in bodies already under stress. This is part of why estimates of heat deaths often include both a directly reported number and a much larger estimated figure, because so much of the true toll happens quietly in homes and hospitals, without ever being clearly labeled as heat-related in official statistics. For construction workers, farm laborers, delivery drivers, and anyone else whose job keeps them outdoors through the hottest hours of the day, this summer has meant a genuine ongoing physical risk, not just discomfort. Some countries have introduced or expanded rules requiring employers to adjust outdoor working hours during extreme heat warnings, shifting labor to early mornings or evenings when temperatures are more tolerable. Hospitals in several regions have reported increases in heat-related admissions, ranging from dehydration and heat exhaustion to more severe cases of heat stroke, a condition that can become life-threatening within a very short window if the body isn't cooled down quickly enough. Emergency services in some cities have described this summer as one of their busiest in years, not because of any single catastrophic event, but because of the steady, cumulative strain that weeks of extreme heat place on people's bodies, particularly those already living with heart or lung conditions. Older adults face a particularly difficult version of this risk, especially those living alone in upper-floor apartments without air conditioning, a common situation across much of Europe, where cooling systems have historically been far less common than in hotter regions of the world like the southern United States or the Middle East. Public health officials in multiple countries have run campaigns urging people to check in on elderly neighbors and relatives during heatwave periods, encouraging simple steps like staying hydrated, closing curtains during the hottest parts of the day, and seeking out air-conditioned public spaces such as libraries or shopping centers when home cooling isn't an option. These campaigns exist precisely because so many heat deaths in past summers have involved people who were isolated and simply didn't have anyone checking whether they were coping with the conditions at all. Despite all of this, there's no single dramatic turning point expected anytime soon. Forecasts heading into the later part of this summer point to a continued risk of further heat waves, with little sign of meaningful, sustained relief. River flow predictions suggest that many catchments across France, the Alpine region, and Eastern Europe are likely to see low to extremely low water levels persist right through the rest of the season. In other words, this isn't a crisis that arrived and will simply pass. It is a slow, grinding condition that Europe is going to have to keep managing, week after week, for the remainder of the summer. It's worth pausing on the question scientists get asked most often during summers like this one. Why does Europe seem to be warming faster than many other parts of the world? Part of the answer lies in geography. Europe sits close to the Arctic, a region that has been warming at several times the global average rate in recent decades. As Arctic ice melts and the temperature difference between the pole and the equator shrinks, it changes the behavior of the jet stream, the powerful band of wind high in the atmosphere that normally helps steer weather systems across the continent. A weaker, more erratic jet stream tends to get stuck in place more often, allowing high-pressure systems, the kind that bring clear skies and rising heat, to settle over one region for days or even weeks at a time instead of moving through quickly. These stalled high-pressure systems are often exactly what meteorologists mean when they describe a heat dome, a large area of hot air trapped in place, pressing down and intensifying as the days go on. Europe's proximity to the Mediterranean Sea adds another layer to this pattern. As sea surface temperatures there continue to rise, the air passing over the Mediterranean carries more heat and moisture into southern Europe, feeding into the kind of intense, sticky heat waves that have become increasingly common in Spain, Italy, and southern France. At the same time, that warmer air can also fuel the kind of sudden, violent storms that sometimes follow prolonged heat. Though in a summer as dry as this one, any rain that does arrive is often too brief or too localized to meaningfully ease the broader drought. Land use plays a role too. Much of Europe's landscape has been extensively farmed, paved, and built upon for centuries, leaving less naturally forested or wetland area than in some other parts of the world, areas that would otherwise help retain moisture and moderate local temperatures. When soil dries out early in the season, as it did this year, less energy from the sun goes into evaporating ground moisture and more goes directly into heating the air near the surface, creating a feedback loop that can push daytime temperatures even higher than they would be over consistently damp ground. Governments across the region have responded in different ways, but a common thread runs through many of these responses, urgency mixed with a recognition that short-term fixes can only do so much. Water restrictions have been introduced or expanded in country after country, from hosepipe bans in the UK to emergency measures for farmers in parts of Switzerland, a country that hadn't seen a drought of comparable severity in around 50 years. National drought groups have been convened to coordinate responses across regions, bringing together water companies, agricultural representatives, and government officials to try to manage limited supplies as fairly and efficiently as possible. But these measures, by their nature, are reactive. They help manage a crisis that's already underway, rather than preventing the underlying conditions that caused it in the first place. Longer term, some of these same governments have started talking more seriously about structural changes, the kind that take years to plan and implement, but that could meaningfully reduce the impact of future summers like this one. That includes investment in reservoir capacity, upgrading leaking water pipe networks that lose enormous volumes of treated water before it even reaches homes, redesigning agricultural irrigation to be more efficient, and reconsidering building codes so that new construction accounts for extreme heat rather than treating it as a rare exception. Some cities have begun experimenting with reflective road surfaces designed to absorb less heat, alongside efforts to expand urban tree cover since shaded streets can run measurably cooler than exposed ones during peak summer afternoons. None of these solutions are quick, and none of them are cheap, but the summers of 2022, 2025, and now 2026 have made the argument for them increasingly difficult to dismiss as overcautious planning for an unlikely future. What ties all of this together, from the exposed shipwreck in the Danube to the cracked farmland in Spain to the hosepipe bans across Wales, is a simple, uncomfortable truth. Europe's water systems, the rivers, reservoirs, and groundwater that entire nations have built their lives around for centuries, are being tested in ways they weren't originally designed to handle. Infrastructure built for a cooler, wetter climate is now being asked to function through longer, hotter, drier summers, arriving more frequently than they used to, and lasting longer once they arrive. None of this means every summer from here forward will look exactly like this one. Weather remains variable, and any single year can still bring more rain, cooler temperatures, or return to more typical conditions. But the broader pattern, 3 severe heat and drought events within just the last 4 years in 2022, 2025, and now 2026, is difficult to dismiss as simple coincidence. Each of these summers has pushed rivers to new record lows, strained agriculture, fueled devastating wildfires, and, tragically, cost thousands of lives. There's also a quieter, less visible cost that tends to get overlooked once the headlines move on to something else. Ecosystems that took decades to establish, wetlands, riverbank habitats, ancient woodlands, don't simply bounce back the moment rain finally returns. Fish populations stressed by warm, low rivers can take years to recover, if they recover at all in certain stretches of water. Trees weakened by repeated drought become more vulnerable to disease and pests for seasons afterward, even once rainfall returns to normal. Soil that has been baked and cracked under direct sun for weeks loses some of its structure and its ability to absorb water quickly when rain does eventually fall, which paradoxically increases the risk of flash flooding once the drought finally breaks, since parched ground can't soak up sudden heavy rainfall the way healthy, moist soil can. In this way, a severe drought summer can end up setting the stage for a different kind of extreme weather event just months later. For now, the immediate story is still unfolding. Rivers across the continent remain at historic lows, with forecasters warning there's little relief in sight before autumn. Wildfires continue to threaten new areas as dry conditions persist. And in towns and cities from England to Germany to France, millions of people are adjusting their daily lives around water restrictions, extreme heat warnings, and the quiet, growing understanding that a summer like this may not be a rare exception anymore, but something closer to the new normal. The rivers will eventually rise again. The heat will eventually break, at least for this year. But the questions this summer has raised about infrastructure, about preparation, and about how quickly a continent can adapt to a climate that no longer resembles the one it was built for, those questions aren't going away with the change of season. They'll be waiting again next summer and the summer after that, for a Europe that is still learning just how much its rivers, its farmland, and its people can withstand.